So welcome to Owning Up to the Urban Lecture Series 2023. This series is hosted by the Master of Urban Design degrees at both the University of Michigan and the University of Virginia. And we are truly excited to be hosting today our first guest speaker. And here we are, Maria Arquero de Alarcón, faculty at the University of Michigan, and my colleague,
Mona El-Kafif from the University of Virginia.
So Mona, you can take it from here.
Sorry. Yeah, welcome everyone. This semester, we are specifically interested in featuring novel organizational infrastructures in which the design disciplines resemble and to devise experimental approaches in urban design to capture its complexity and uncertainty. This is the second lecture series. The last round, we were looking and inviting at colleagues and researchers and scholars who were implementing specifically one-to-one projects. This year, we are inviting our colleagues from labs, very often embedded in the context of academic institutions, non-profit organization or large professional firms. Labs and centers and clusters are very often productive configurations where research methodologies and strategies can be experimented with, challenged and innovated.
So in our lecture series this year, we are going to be examining the formation of 7 organizational units, and you can see them rolling in the screen, starting today and going on up to 7 of them. And the guest speakers are going to be sharing with us what are some of the operational logics of these units, the work that is emerging from them. We have invited them to discuss their projects in their temporal and spatial logics, how they are accessing funding and resources, and what are some of the strategies that they are using to engage diverse publics and ensure that they are advancing different strategies of co-production in many instances.
Yeah, we prompted all speakers to address specific questions in their presentation. Among those questions about agency, methodology, the actors that are involved, actions that they are taking, the way how their projects are funded and how their work could be replicated in other places globally. Today, we are welcoming TANEHA KUZNIECOW BACCHIN, and we are really excited to have you here today from the TU and Delft. And the students are from now taking on to introduce you.
Thank you, Maria and Mona. So TANEHA KUZNIECOW BACCHIN is an assistant professor of urban design theory and methods at the section of urban design and research program leader Urbanism at the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment Delft University of Technology. TANEHA holds degrees in architecture and urban design from the University of Venice, Italy, and University of Brasilia, Brazil, and territorial landscape planning and design from IUAV, Italy. In 2015, she obtained a PhD in landscape architecture and water science and engineering from Delft University and UNESCO-IHE.
Her research and projects focus on the relationship between landscape architecture, infrastructure, and urban form. She has expertise in water-sensitive, nature-based design and environmental risk. Her current work deals with the changing nature of the territorial project, addressing spatial, political, and economic aspects of extreme weather and resource scarcity, particularly focusing on the North Sea region and the Arctic. Her work has been funded internationally and exhibited at the Venice Architecture Biennale 2002 and 2018, and Sao Paulo Architecture Biennale 2013. Before starting her academic career, she worked for architecture and urban planning practices in Brazil, Italy, and Denmark. She is principal investigator and coordinator of the DST NWO Water for Change research program, Indian Dutch framework on urban water systems, and coordinator for the TU Delft Brazil engagement theme, design, planning, and governance of the built environment.
Thank you. I think, TANEHA, if you can share your screen, we could start.
Sorry, just one second from my side. Can you see my screen?
Yes,
Yes. I guess now.
Maybe go on full screen share.
Now full screen, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, well, once again, thank you so much for having me today. It's really wonderful to be with you, quite far away, but at the same time, I think very close in terms of the, let's say, of the thinking and scope of the two schools in how actually we can foster the question of the urban project and what is the agency in that sense of the designer in engaging with the complexities of life nowadays. So I entitled this talk today as critical thinking, action, and form to situate, because if I would have, and actually that was a very nice exercise for me to think about what could define the work that we have been doing in the previous years in the, let's say, within the section and the faculty, but especially by means of educational projects and research projects. And I think this search to constantly situate oneself, and especially to situate practice, both, again, in terms of education and research, has been perhaps the most essential part of the work. And that somehow moves always in this three component parts, let's say, of the how can we keep on evolving our way of thinking and to be critical about, well, again, the different influences of life informing design, how actually that critical thinking leads to the decision about certain actions that one can envision or should take place, and what is the form, then what is the spatial form, the spatial contribution to that.
Taneha, I'm going to interrupt you because there is, we don't see full screen. So just so that you are aware that we may be looking at the other screen that you are sharing, so.
Sorry. So also there is something with the file. Stop share, I'm going to share again. Okay.
It's still the same, so I wonder if it's something that you can control. And now it's perfect. There you go.
Okay.
Super.
There is something with the writing, but anyway, sorry for that. So actually you cannot see it. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened, but basically what I put in this slide was the questions that I received from you that I found that they were very, again, critical questions. So I just wanted, before I go through the projects, I chose some projects actually to exemplify my answer to those questions. I would like just to touch quickly upon them. So what is the nature of the work and its relevance? I think, again, this point of this search to situate design, to situate thinking, and actually to revalue things. So it has been quite, especially most recently, quite of an ontological question of actually how do we assign meaning to things, to, let's say, to what has been established. And in that sense, how from the understanding of what could be then the long durée values and things that actually we have to keep, but also the things that to a certain extent we have to let go, and what are the implications of that. So I think it's very much a question again of to situate oneself to the context and to the needs of that specific context, of that specific cultural and societal context and environmental conditions, and then see what are the values in place and what, let's say, it's how to continue those values, and again, what are the consequences of that. And from that point of view, how then to move forward. between adaptation and radical transformation. So how do we work and how actually what shapes the project and an output type? We have been, well, I have been personally working, and I think especially since my PhD, very much on this, on the understanding of, try to understand interscalarity or the transscalarity of things. So actually how in space and time, well, again, life and inhabitation evolve between in this constant relationship between environment and society. What is nature actually? Is there? Can we still call something as nature, as pristine nature? So very much also looking into the anthropological dimension on the, let's say, on the human impact in natural processes and the feedback of that, again, in conditions of life. So I think that has been quite defining, and it's very much also part of the Delft School. So this, especially of the urbanism dimension of that, to search through scales, the understanding of the relationships of elements and processes throughout scales, the subjects and objects involved in that, and then again, especially the let's say the dynamics involved. So I would say from the understanding of values and let's say the contingency and the meaning of values nowadays, in the past, present and future, the question of interscalarity and relationships. Partners and stakeholders, and how do we approach coalition building? So partners, we have been, let's say, throughout, again, both educational activities and research activities. Partners are quite diverse from practice, actually from, let's say, engaging with practice of urban design, landscape architecture and architecture and engineering, to public institutions and stakeholders, so at the regional and city level, but also with NGOs. I think that has also been quite important. And then more, let's say, on the international level. So for instance, also with the project that I'm gonna close, which was also mentioned, Water for Change, which is a bilateral cooperation between India and the Netherlands. So also that has been a very important learning process for us, how actually when you bring two countries together, how does knowledge transfer and what are the assumptions and again in the values in place and in play in that sense. So also in that project, we have, for instance, working very closely with stakeholders in case study cities, different levels of stakeholders, from users to community representatives to mayors, and also that has been a very important learning process. So the co-creation of design going beyond academia and actually trying to be as much closer possible, let's say, as much closer to the reality on the ground. And again, and that specific, let's say, relationship with ground conditions, informing back how we are developing knowledge from an academic and scientific perspective. So how do the projects operate? Well, I would say that all these dimensions are somehow in place, and they, in different degrees, according to the project. The question of innovation, we are somehow questioning that, again, especially from the point of view of this Indian project, but also we have a new recent South African project, another bilateral cooperation between the Netherlands and South Africa. And also we have been trying to decolonize as much as we can this idea that Dutch expertise can be, let's say, transposed and translated to other contexts. So all the implications of that, and we are trying to deconstruct that as much as possible. So it's not the Dutch that brings innovation into another place, but actually both countries seek together to understand how, again, from past to present, conditions of life have unfolded, and how the understanding, again, of science and of on-ground conditions from these different countries together, they can inform a different form of practice. So we have been, as much as possible, trying to look back, to look to the past, to learn from the past before claiming that we have to innovate by default. So there is much to learn and to repair in that sense. So I think now it's very much on more on the question of repair, to empower and to heal. And in that sense, also very important, I think, the question of how to anticipate. In that sense, the projective dimension of design. So this point of, let's say, of the longue durée informing then the projective dimension of design. So what actually we can anticipate, again, learning from the past. So how are the projects sustained? That's a very good question. I think they might be best sustained if we are able to engage closely with those actually on the ground, developing and implementing and maintaining whatever has been envisioned. So I think the sustainability of projects is very much this again quest of developing ways that the project can be appropriated by the users, by those actually closely engaged on the site. So I think this is quite important. So actually how to develop the appropriation conditions, and in that sense maintenance can be, and it always has been also a very important question to us. So not only the transposition and translation of methods, but actually really coming from the ground. So finally, what strategies enable the transferability and scalability of the work? I think I would answer this question by the projects, but also that has been quite of a topical question now. And the scalability, again, it's about, I think, the importance of constructing arenas for exchange between different groups, between different again, between different cities, between different communities. So how different stakeholders and users, they can come together, and scientists, they can come together in specific arenas of exchange. So I think this idea of the peer-to-peer learning and to foster candid conversations, it's also quite important, and the understanding of actually how can we foster that. So then again, sorry that things are missing, but moving. So in short, so this question of time and movement, you cannot read in the slide, and the longue durée of that. So how actually, what have been the movements in values and in the specific constructions that those values led in space, so actually how space has been produced out of these moving societal values and the ecology of that, and what has been constituted as the longue durée. And then again, I'm sorry. So then from time to movement to instability, and then the necessity of a new order. So how, from this understanding of movement and this changing values, and what have been actually the ones that we have been kept close to us, all of that put in let's say in close confrontation with the question now of instability, of uncertainty, then how actually we should envision a form of a new order, or again the reassessment of the spatial qualities that we have now in place. So something that, again, I'm just moving between these two pictures by Bas Prinsen, a photographer. Sorry, my computer is playing with me today. Which is this question, as I started with the what is nature? So actually, how do we again understand the meaning of things, of the values that we have been using to inform our practice, and how do we frame? Let's say we have been framing things from the past to present, and how actually we might frame and assign different meanings in the future. So what is nature has been a very important question to that. Is there something that we can call pristine nature? So if we are about to engage with the design of nature, with the performance of nature, actually what we mean about that, what are the implications of that. And as you can see in this picture as well, knowing that the human dimension will be always present in different degrees, but it will always be present. So in that sense, also what it's in that sense, the interrelations that we might establish between natural processes and human practices in uncertain futures. So all projects, they move between this question of space, fragility, and time. So the temporal dimension of movements and values, what stays and what has been changing and what should change in the future to accommodate uncertainty and urgencies in place. What is the spatial dimension again of that, and all of that, how actually, to a certain extent, we have been considering as a sort of state of fragility in practice as well, not only in places and communities that we have been working with, but especially in practice. So this is something that also, just to bring some sort of personal note, this is my hometown, Porto Alegre in Brazil, and this kind of black sky was something that always was present with me, and that actually that led to the practice that I entered, and especially also the one now in close connection with the Delft School. So this point of looking into weather events, into, let's say, to this change in climate, and the understanding of how does this change in climate actually relates to the built form, and again, and how does the built form actually could somehow respond to this changing climatic and environmental conditions. So again, these two moments, let's say, of a very fast changing environmental condition, and somehow the stable structures and the rigid and the values from the past, and how actually up to what extent we can adapt the existing built form, and up to what extent actually we can let go of some existing forms of infrastructure and assets. So this is, let's say, as a sort of synthesis of the topics that all projects have been dealing with in different degrees. So the question of infrastructure and territoriality, so how we go about infrastructural projects in the future, the projection of infrastructural projects, knowing of, let's say, the longue durée of things that we have, the existing assets that we have with us, so how actually we can adapt the existing infrastructure, and what is the space to envision novelty in that, and how actually that it's defined by a certain territorial dimension and values in place. So again, in that sense, how do we inhabit time, and how do we inhabit and use infrastructure, and how does infrastructure has been put in place to accommodate urgencies of life, and especially to anticipate uncertainties. What has been then, in that sense, the ecological dimension, even also the perception and the phenomenological dimension, especially in knowing that this quest of appropriation of projects. So how do we perceive space? How do we perceive infrastructure and the territory surrounding us? Actually, what do we own? So also the question of ownership, I think that's quite important, the changing dimension of that. And then all of that put in question by this point of risk and uncertainty, climatic and environmental and ecological risk and uncertainty, but also socioeconomic, of course, and political. And that in that sense, what it's the design agency in terms of adaptation, transformation, and even transposition of things from learnings from places to other places, and how all of that construct a narrative of design, and what might be especially the interruptions that we should maybe engage in a quite, perhaps in a bold way, of things that actually should be discontinued from past and present. So, and then going into the design dimension, also as in the title of the talk, so critical thinking, action, and form. So then how we go about design. So design in terms of form, geometry, topography, and topology. So methods to understand the topographical dimension of space, but also the relational aspects of space in terms of, in that sense, the topology of elements, but also design as a very important critical thinking instrument in the production of knowledge and consciousness, and design as an action in space and time, and again, and the formation of conditions of life. In Delft School, I also brought this because it's quite important. It's something that we move quite constantly between these two dimensions. So the architectural dimension as the enclosed, the defined space, the concrete space, and the abstract dimension, which is the environmental, some sort of more related to the landscape, to the waterscape, to the environmental one. And the sea has been quite important in that. So this idea of the open, the endless dimension, so the open dimension of design, how can actually the architectural practice move from a concrete dimension to an abstract dimension to something that is undefined. So when we talked about, for instance, the adaptation and the need to think of frameworks that actually could evolve in type so they could learn from contingency and adapt themselves to changing needs, how do we do that? How can we can think about flexibility, what flexibility means in design? And I think this is somehow this movement between the concrete and the abstract dimension. And I like very much this picture because somehow also show how to say the challenge in that, because when you face something that is very concrete to something that is quite open as the sea, and then what might be again often the answer from an architectural perspective is to frame rigidly. So if we would have to break this wall down, how then we think about this sort of relational space, the interface between these two very different types of landscapes. So I think also that has been a very important question to us. So when we think about this, for instance, a coastal space, what is a coastal space? How do we bring two systems of different kind together? How do we build this dialogue between very different natures in design? And again, being in the Netherlands, reinforce very much this point. We are a nation of risk, and uncertainty defines being in the Netherlands. So this is the map of the country, in which you can see in gray. It's actually the sea level. So most of the country it's under sea level, and you can see in red the urbanizational spots. So the Netherlands, it's a very high dense country. So quite dense population, living most of 60% of the population living under the level of the sea. So in case the dike breaks, we do have quite a major problem. But at the same time, there is, in that sense, it's a very fascinating thing as well to be in the Netherlands, because you realize that the Netherlands, it's a country that do not accept risk. So we are a risk zero country. Because all the infrastructure has been planned to face a probability of an event of 2,000 years. So meaning that the infrastructure is actually extremely capable of pushing the water away from the country. I have been living in the Netherlands now for 12 years. I never experienced a flood. I come from a hometown, again, in my hometown, Porto Alegre in Brazil. I had to learn how to drive when it was flooding. So you are perhaps in the highest potentially risk country to flooding, but actually we do not experience flood. So, and this is something that is also defined very much that Dutch culture to have the feet dry, that the public institutions actually they are responsible to keep the country safe. So in that sense also you can imagine that the social resilience is quite low to that, because we are accounting for the public infrastructure to take care and to keep, let's say, risk levels very low. But of course we have climate change and the rising sea level, of water levels, also especially from the rivers. So more discharge of water from the rivers are expected. So nowadays, finally, the country is taking actually this risk question very much into the table of discussion, and seeing then what might be the future of the country, knowing that we are facing very much this condition of being of the sea and of the river taking major portions of what now it's dry land. So we are a risk society, and that's something that very much defines, let's say, the society of the 21st century, and then put the question of the modern project, again, as a central, the logic actually of the modern project in question. And then especially thinking about moving from, let's say, from the rationality of the modern project, of the separation of things, of the different functions, and of keeping things, let's say, under control by the power of infrastructure. Actually, how can we accommodate more instability, higher state of fragility and uncertainty by thinking about specific aspects of potential, embedded and implicit potential, that perhaps now it's not being used in its full dimension, but especially also the possible connections in place between different systems and different actors on the ground. And I think this is a very, I brought two projects on the Dutch context, which I think are quite exemplary of this moving paradigm in the Dutch approach. So from the dikes and dams and let's say this very high level of engineering, of civil engineering, to take the risk away, actually to accept natural processes and even to learn from them. So it's called the sand engine. So it's in the coast, especially in the coast of The Hague, in the southern part of the Netherlands. And what the project does, so it's a project which was developed by a landscape architect and an engineer together in an open conversation in the afternoon. And they thought, well, what about if we would work with the dynamics of nature, so work with wind and work with the sediment deposition of sand along the coast, and then let that, let's say, natural process of wind blowing and sand deposition to actually form, to nourishment, let's say, the coast, so to form more buffer capacity of the coast throughout time. So very simply, the project basically put a vertical line of sand along the coast, and throughout the years, the wind blow out the sand. And what you can see here, it's an image of, I think, 4 years ago. So in the meantime, the shape of the coast changed, of course, and also very interesting the formation of even new habitats alongside with that. We can see that formation of small ponds of water. So this is a quite, I think, exemplary project of this changing paradigm of actually how can we build with nature by learning from natural processes and designing alongside with them. Then another project that actually came out of as a response to the floods in the Netherlands of 1993 and 1995, but also was somehow already on let's say, on the table of designers some years before that, as a sort of an activism claim that actually the paradigm of flood risk management in the Netherlands should change. And this is the project which is called Room for the River. So Room for the River actually claimed that, well, the title is quite telling. It does exactly what it tells. So Room for the River. So how can we allow for the river to get more of its natural floodplain? So the rivers, they have been fully channelized and engineered. So water, the Netherlands, it's very much this water machine. So it goes all the way contrary to what actually normally water flows by gravity. In the Netherlands, water, actually, it's managed by power. So you have the sea being the highest level and the polder, the land, being the lowest level. And then in the middle, you have the river space. So everything then so you pump water from land to the river and you pump water from the river to the sea. So how can we actually deconstruct somehow this this rationality and let the river gain more space? I'm sorry. So this is what then the project started in 2015. Sorry, it was completed in 2015, but what was a very important aspect of this project, and here you see the city of Nijmegen, was the land reclamation, because especially farmers. So a lot of stakeholders involvement, participatory design with farmers, with communities, because they have to give away their land to let the land be flooded. So the communication on the project was an extremely important component. So the design, to a certain extent, was rather simple. The most, let's say, crucial part in my personal understanding of the project was actually how to engage with the local owners, with the communities, and to let them also appropriate the project themselves. So by, for instance, social media, newspaper articles, photographers going on ground. So very much this understanding of how their traditional landscape and the traditional way of understanding water management would have to change, and what could be then not only the negative consequences of losing land, but actually the beneficial outcomes of such a project on a national level. So all of this now coming then to the question of extremes. So we are then finally entering very much this quest of extremes. So as in approaching limited states, highest in degree. So the meaning of extreme actually implies a state of excessive in degree. So then how we take this question of extremes now even into the rationality of the project. So it really moves on oneself away from what we know. So we have very much to embrace uncertainty to its full dimension. So unpredictability, disequilibrium, and strangeness become, in that sense, a sort of a new normal. And again, how all of that can be encoded and can inform value making and spatial design. So just to give an example, so this is the map, this is the North Sea, and that was actually, we had a graduation studio that ran for 3 years on the North Sea, and we were very much putting the question of what is the new development logic of the North Sea, knowing of these extreme conditions that we might face in the future, political, economic, societal, and environmental. And you can see here, this is the map of the Netherlands in relation to the North Sea and the UK in relation to the North Sea now. And with the changing climate, this is the most probably what will become the map. So you can see major parts of the Netherlands being flooded, but also the UK, London also in that sense. So how then again we go about, if this becomes the new map between sea and land, then what are the, again, how does the project moves alongside with that? How ownership, how the notion of territoriality, how infrastructure and conditions of inhabitation in general will move alongside with this new map. I'm very sorry for all of this. I'm just going to move faster. Something happened, but and informing this is there are these two artists which are quite beautiful work in photography that also inspired very much our way of thinking, especially in the design studios in education. So for instance, this project with actually the electricity is being taken from the pollution of the ground. So this is something that, for instance, in the harbor here, I live in Rotterdam. So in the harbor in Rotterdam, this is quite present. So very high levels of pollution on the ground, and the phasing out of the fossil fuels and industry, but still what remains, it's this highly polluted space and soil and water. So then how we go about a possible alternative project, and perhaps starting from, again, phasing out. So knowing that we cannot just radically kind of greenwash and think that we're going to just leapfrog to a completely different state of being, but actually how we can make use of the existing conditions, thinking differently. So, but also another example, knowing that maybe even cultivation might change. And again, the Netherlands, it's the second after the US, it's the second biggest food production country worldwide, although we are a very tiny portion in relation to the US land-wise. But it's this efficiency of production. So how, what are the consequences of that? What actually we have been tolerating? And for instance, in the Netherlands, again, the soil, it's not used for production. The ground, it's only used as space, not as soil. So what may be, again, sort of the ethics and of practice in the future if we have to foster more of constructed nature. So again, how we go about that. I'm very sorry. To close this sort of, but I also would like, please, to, because I cannot see time, so if you also could just flag me when I have to stop. So to conclude this sort of the conceptual part of how our work have been informed, this is the picture of the last closing exhibition of our graduation studio. The graduation studio has a very important function to us because it's really this atelier and laboratory. So we are testing ways of thinking and putting everything in question and kind of flipping things around with the wonderful thesis students, master students that we have. So they have 1 year to develop the final thesis. And so the studio, it's called Transitional Territories, and it has been very, very much important and informative in then what we put forward more, let's say, concretely in our research projects. And again, and this movement between scales of design, from the very large territorial scale, for instance, at the North Sea level, down to the very fine scale of architectural objects, and again, and the implications of that. So we aim to, in that sense, to develop a practice that it's material, as much as possible, it's situated to the contexts that the students are working, or that our research projects we have, we can engage with, and how this idea of moving through different scales in time and space, understanding past values and conditions, informing and grounding present, and then how we anticipate then the future. So this is also just for you to see the inside of the faculty. This is our model hall, and it's a very lively space. And also I think something that also has been very important is the use of different media. So making of documentaries, students, they have been quite engaged in the making of documentaries. Of course, working with different physical models and materials, but also workshops with and interviews with stakeholders. So we have been playing out also with the use of different media in that. So here I start with the projects. How much time I have left, if I may ask?
10 minutes max.
10 minutes, okay. Then I'm gonna jump between things. But to start with this one, this was a project that we developed between 2013 and 2017. It's a joint about funding. So this is a joint program initiative. So within Europe, we have different types of funding. And this one is quite special because it's very much about cities. So the focus of the exchange between cities in Europe. We also have Horizon Europe, which is a much broader type of funding scheme. But the JPI, the Joint Program Initiative, it's quite interesting because it's funding that comes from the countries. So it's not from the European Union, but actually each country has to provide its own funding, and it has to be about living labs. So different cities in Europe that come together and they form different living labs. So a very close connection, again, with ground conditions, with stakeholders' involvement and participatory processes. And for this one especially was a very fascinating one because we had 3 cities, Kiruna in Sweden, Innsbruck in Austria, and Zwolle in the Netherlands. And it was about the project of green-blue infrastructure. So actually, how can we envision green-blue infrastructure design and engineering for sustainable and attractive cities. But Kiruna was the main living lab. And Kiruna, it's a city that it's located in the Arctic, 145 kilometers north from the Arctic line. It's the biggest municipal area after Mexico City, but one of the lowest dense places. So you have 2 inhabitants each square kilometer. So it's a city that was founded because of the mining. So it's the biggest iron ore mine worldwide. So it's this mining city, and actually recently they found even more minerals. So it's a very rich underground site. So Kiruna, it's a perforated landscape. And the reason for this perforation actually led to the point that the city has to move. So the city is sinking, as other actually small towns nearby. So then the Kiruna municipality put the question, well, we have to move the city, because the city that now it's very close connected. So you see here, this is was the existing city of Kiruna, and this is the mine. And this, well, especially the core was sinking. So the full city has to move 3 kilometers eastward. So a competition was launched in 2014, a design competition, and we came as a research project to envision then what could be, since they have to move the city, and in that sense, the development of a new master plan, then how can we go about also a green-blue development of that new city. So this was one of the first master plan designs, but then the master plan as well kept on moving throughout the years of the project. And you can see here, this is quite fascinating. So from the existing town, the new, let's say the city being moved 3 kilometers eastward, and some historical elements, so the church and important homes, let's say, of architectural heritage, they were literally taken, I think, lifted and moved to a new plot. But the infrastructure, especially the drainage infrastructure, had to transition from its existing location to the new location. But then, and you can see here, let's say, this movement of the city. But then when we as, let's say, the researchers involved in the project, when we faced this question, we realized that how actually you can design a green-blue infrastructure in a city, again, sorry for coming back, that it's like this 9 months a year. So the city is completely covered in snow 9 months a year. So, and green-blue infrastructure, it's about the conveyance of water by means of vegetated spaces. So when you do have precipitation, but precipitation is actually snow and ice. So then how we go about. So this led us to envision, to really enter this puzzle and to think about this kind of land, water, snow script. So how could we think of the relationship between land, water, and snow? So would be then a green, blue, and white infrastructure. So moving between these two very extreme conditions of life throughout the season. So you have 9 months of snow, and here Kiruna, there is the midnight sun. So then in a very short period of time of a month, you have the full blooming of spring and summer. So then you have this wonderful green landscape that lasts for 3 months. So how we go about the use of these two seasonal variations. So to not go much in detail, but then we envision this in the new master plan, in the new design, what would be the most important paths of water in the city out of topographical conditions and topological conditions of site. And then when we zoom into the level of, let's say, at the neighborhood, at the district level, how does then the design of public and private space could accommodate this flow of snow and melting water and rain. So it's all about this kind of coding of land use and land form and land cover. to accommodate, again, these different levels of precipitation throughout the seasons and the different volumes and again, the distribution of this volume. But this, what came very much, and I think here especially, this was quite telling. And this comes then to the question of, again, of relationship, what I started with, the point of how can actually we understand relationships and dynamics in place between different systems, elements, subjects, and values. So this question of infrastructure ecology, we understood that we need actually to couple the drainage infrastructure with district heating, because in that way, if we would envision a system that could combine the different types of infrastructure, electricity, district heating, and drainage infrastructure, the exceedance of heat from electricity and the district heating infrastructure could help us to melt the ice being formed on top of the surface of the sidewalks and the streets, and that actually could help us to, to drain the water more efficiently, especially in that moment of the melting from the iced condition to the de-iced condition. So that was quite important, that idea of the, let's say, of the industrial ecology, so the coupling of the different infrastructural systems. And then again, and then the multifunctionality of that was also very important, that especially in close connection and consultation with the stakeholders and users. So how do they use space? And we found out that it was so, that it's not because it's the city is completely covered in snow that public life does not exist. It does exist quite a lot. So for instance, here you can see a half pipe made out of snow, which is quite normal. So there is a lot of sport life in the public space of the city happening. So how actually we could envision space that could, in the design, could accommodate these different seasonal uses and and again, and the performance of that. Again, I think section-wise, and especially this project was very much about understanding section. So how we go about the technical sections and how the technical sections alongside with the cultural understanding of the use of space could lead us to the design of the full landscape of a sort of a network of green, blue, and white in that context places. So I don't know if maybe I can just jump to the very final one, which is the Indian project, and then we can conclude. So going back to the title, so this search to situate, this is what really informed this project is called Water for Change. And it's, as I said, it's a bilateral cooperation between the Netherlands and India. It was a very interesting project because the consortium was formed out of a sandpit process, meaning that a number of, so it was a call for individual researchers to apply. And we were selected 15 in the Netherlands and 15 in India. And we were all brought together to Delhi for 4 days of a sandpit, of a full immersion, in which the panel gave us exercises, and most of us, we didn't know each other. And then out of those exercises, as being in a sandpit, we formed groups. So it was really fascinating because the groups, they were formed out of affinity in terms of ways of thinking, of value, assignment, ethics in practice, and so on. And out of this, let's say, sandpit, then 3 groups were formed. And then we went back home, we developed the full proposal. And then, well, we were lucky enough to be the group selected. And the project, it's about, so this bilateral cooperation, it's about urban water in secondary cities in India. And this is quite important because it's about fast-growing cities. So secondary cities, especially in the context of India, are the cities which are growing faster and, and more in comparison, for instance, to Mumbai, Delhi, and so on, Chennai, Calcutta. So, but they face quite important infrastructural deficits, also financial barriers. So they do not have the same level of accessibility to funding as the primary cities have, although they are facing many urgencies. So, so the program really put focus on them. So, and how can we envision a knowledge framework that could inform infrastructural planning, design, and engineering, and especially investments on infrastructure for secondary cities in India. And what was specific about our proposal was the point of water sensitivity. So, and maybe you know, so water sensitivity as a concept was coined in Australia some years ago, especially by the work of Monash University in Australia. So it's this idea that moving as well the paradigm of water management as being something that stays on within the discipline of civil engineering and environmental engineering, and actually that says we cannot keep on coping with the levels of uncertainty just by traditional infrastructure. We have to couple traditional infrastructure with spatial design. So then what about the urban design dimension of water, of urban water, and the landscape architectural dimension of urban water? But somehow the idea of water sensitivity as it's this sort of evolution, this sort of incremental steps. And we as a project, we came to the project with two oppositions. The first one, the program was about Dutch innovation informing Indian practice. And we started by saying we are not going to do that. We oppose that firmly, because there is so much intelligent infrastructure in place, especially from the past, which has been somehow lost. So the project starts by reading, aiming as much as possible to read in a very sensible manner the existing conditions at site. And how can we go about the use of what we have, the repurposing, the reparations of what we have, and in that sense, see then the scope of innovation. So again, it's not about Dutch technology being implemented in India, but it's about both countries coming together with the expertise, the different expertise that we have, and understanding what are this constellation of relations between that urban water problems are not just engineering and technological problems. They are social problems, they are political problems, they are ecological, they are spatial problems. So the root cause of the mismanagement of urban water nowadays, and how does the different domains as in governance, society and culture, spatial planning and design, technology and infrastructure engineering, actually the interrelation between them, what is the play field of those domains in the let's say, in the existing condition of urban water performance. So the first opposition was, it's not about innovations, it's about going and looking at site and understanding this relationship between domains. And the second opposition was about the point of water sensitivity, that it's not something that we're going to move from a waterway type of city to a water supply city, and then all the steps until we achieve the optimal condition of a water sensitive city. No, water sensitivity already exists and has been existing since the past. So it's about understanding the different degrees of sensitivity of societal behavior, so the water sensitive behavior of society and individuals and citizens, the water sensitivity of existing spatial practices in place, and the residuals of that, and the governance capacities in place. So that was, in that sense, the sensitivity as in being incremental, adding different degrees. So this is that's India, and those are our three cities. Bhopal, which is a city of lakes, very much quite of a common type of urban condition for secondary cities in India. Then we have Bhuj, which is an arid city. extremely interesting, fascinating, the vernacular water infrastructure at the catchment level. And then finally, Kozhikode or Calicut, which is in the coastal of Kerala. So we have an arid, a coastal, and an inland lake type of city. The combination of the three cities, so we chose them because they are archetypical in terms of climate, environment, and cultural, very rich, diverse of cultural conditions and language conditions. So the combination of the three of them could give us a good understanding of the more general condition of secondary cities. So that's also, it's a sort of strategy for upscaling. So to be minimum in selection of cases, but to understand what are the most archetypical cases for upscaling. And then just to conclude, again, the moving between scales. So this is just the city of Kozhikode. So the understanding of what is the territory of Kozhikode, it's beyond the catchment, let's say the river basin catchment. That's something that also takes other portions into place from an ecological and cultural perspective. So how do we define what is the territory from an ecological and from a hydrological and from a cultural perspective? What are the, let's say, the juxtaposition of different landscapes and ways of living and using practices down to, so we move from a territorial scale, the redefinition of the territorial scale, to the ensemble scale, which means the, let's say, the habitat around a certain practice in relation to water. And I'm just going to show you here, these are traditional practices, these are the sacred groves. So wetlands, which are considered sacred, so they have they are kept pristine because of the very important religious connotation that they have, and especially what you can see here, it's the mangroves. So very close connection between cultural and religious practices and natural protection in that sense. And you can see the specific type of practice, the, let's say, the landscape around that practice, or the ensemble around that practice, and the position of the practice throughout the territory. This is another type of practice, which is the, for instance, the paper plantation, also very important. It's a city of spices, Kozhikode. So also that has been traditionally quite knowledgeable of conditions of soil, so giving back to soil after plantation in this point of keeping the cycle of restoration of soil and water restoration. Also the paddy cultures, very important in that, in the maintenance as well of buffering capacities between land and water, and well, and more, let's say, the fish farming, the cultures of fish farming, and how they have been go about the understanding of this specificity of the landscape, the protection of the landscape, and how much that, especially the fish farmers, they have been impacted by urbanization processes throughout the region. So this is the final slide. So, and the most recent form of practice, which is called the canali canal, which is a canal cutting through the city, but also have been quite important in connecting these different traditional practices throughout the, let's say, perpendicular to the coastal space. So this has been our effort until now, to really read site-specific water practices and the logic of development of them through time, from a political, from a social, cultural, and environmental and economic perspective, the different play between the domains in that, and how we could then go about a new design in a way that, or let's say projection of change in the future, that would take everything that exists and understand that from a systemic dimension. So what could be, in that sense, what is the scope of adaptation, of reparation, of fostering of these existing practices as in new locations, or even the implementation of novel practices which are necessary, again, to cope with especially the urgencies, but also the uncertainties in the future. And that was my thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Taneha. Thank you so much for this incredible talk. We are going to transition now to our Q&A. And while we give a bit of time for our colleagues to share comments and questions, we would like to hear your reflections on a couple of prompts, if you may. So we would like to get started with an invitation for you to share your thoughts on a question that we are asking all our guests to give form to a sort of urban manifesto that we are working on during this semester. So what is the urban question that our work should address today with like the most sense of urgency? What do you think about that?
For me, for us, has been the question of instability, but instability not only as in future projections, again, as I was showing before in the presentation, in terms of rising waters or socio-political and economical instability and uncertainty, but also the instability of the agency of design. So how do we again, I'm going to repeat myself, but what are the values of our practice, of our discipline from the past that have been very much informing the way that we design, that we should put in question in light of all this, let's say, of this landscape of uncertainty that we have in front of us. So it's an instability of, let's say, of the way of understanding, I would say. So things that we take for granted and that we considered certain, they are no longer certain. And the instability of, well, again, of this landscape of life in front of us. So I think this is something that has been very much in the question of sort of what may be the frontier of the urban project, knowing that we have to take a grounded, again, as much as possible, a grounded look into the agency of design, what actually we can do. Although my scholarship has been very much about, again, green-blue infrastructure, nature-based solutions, and, designing with nature. Most recently, I have been put all of that in question, also the question of resilience to whom, for whom, to what. I think we go too quickly into, also I can tell from our students in Delft, all projects, they have to be circular, sustainable, resilient, and just, and spatial just. But up to what extent, actually, by design, we are really addressing those concepts. So up to what extent, again, what is the agency of spatial design? What are the limits of our practice, of our profession? And in that, I think the second point, so beyond, let's say, this embracing of instability and being conscious about that, the second point is that we have to search for knowledge from others. So the transdisciplinarity, the interdisciplinarity, it's extremely important. So really to be informed and to aim to learn from others and to be open to learn from others. So not that the architect can solve everything.
Yeah, that's like taking an interdisciplinary approach. So now I would like to invite my colleagues, if there are any questions, if anyone wants to have a discussion, we are open for it. Okay, so I think moving on, we have other questions we are very interested in, like letting us know. So going with, we always discuss the interdisciplinary nature of urban design, and we see that, and we know about you, that you are trained in multiple disciplines. So what urban design brings to these like complex projects that you're currently working on, and how does your, like interdisciplinary nature and your studies have actually helped you in the way you take your projects on and the way that you work on different projects? How does that form your approach towards working on different projects?
Thank you. To start with the first part, I think that let's say in that sense, the agency of design is this relational thinking, so that we think through relations. So and that, in my experience, has been very powerful in engaging different stakeholders, different experts. So that sort of creative way of thinking. So to imagine things differently, also to be quite, perhaps you have the freedom to do so. So when, and then moving to the second part, when I realized that if I want to really work on flood risk management, I had also to be more acquainted with water engineering and science. I realized that from an engineering perspective, you really, the scope is to solve. So it's a solution-driven type of approach. So it's, in that sense, it's very difficult to accommodate this kind of freedom of imagination, because the profession claims for the solution, so to bring forward solutions. So I think design, really the beauty and the power of design, of urban design, especially because in that sense embraces different scales, is to really to be able to think through relations, to imagine different conditions of life, but also in that sense, so this systemic way of working. The scope of the different why, and I went about different disciplines, and also the scope of that in my work was exactly that. I understood that I am an architect by let's say by formation, but then when I started to work, I realized how that to stay on the level of build structures was not sufficient for me to engage with context. So and in that sense, whenever you start entering the question of context of site on a broader scale of landscapes, then easily you move to those other disciplines as territorial planning, landscape architecture on a larger context. But then again, also especially, I think the point then of environmental sciences and engineering. So these are just some. I think now, especially with the Water for Change project, we have been a lot exposed to social sciences, to anthropology, and it's quite fascinating. So also to the political sciences, political ecology. So yeah, again, I think it really depends on the type of practice and on the type of project that we have at hand, and then the needs of specific disciplinary inputs for that.
Okay, that sounds good. So we have one question from one of our colleagues. So she's asking, Vishnupriya is asking, like, what were some challenges with working with India, like on your project? And what can we learn from this process as urban designers who would like to work on international projects in general?
Language. But language, and also that it's quite in a surprising way. I'm very ignorant of the Indian context. I can only claim that I know a bit about Brazil and Italy to a certain extent, but India really is so rich in different languages. So as you move between this, I mean, at each city has a variety of languages. So, how do you go about translations of concepts? So something that I really have, and I'm still learning how to, when I go to that project, my language has to change, meaning that has to be much simpler, because it has to be able to convey the message to different groups. So let's say this sort of how can we simplify concepts? How can we ground concepts so then they can be understood by means of drawings, by means of words? So I think this kind of the necessity to carefully choose words. How do we assign meaning to things? What we can claim as generic. I think there is very little generic. How can we go about the specific? How can we be respectful in claiming knowledge? Also, I think this is very important and very delicate. I still find quite difficult to have a Dutch group mapping an Indian context. So, and especially the project started in COVID. So we had the kickoff meeting March 2020. we closed the faculty with COVID. So, and then we saw the full first 2.5 years of the project were just online, and the project was all about field work and co-creation workshops. So, so you really have to be very, I think, careful about how you go about assigning meaning and communicating the project.
Okay, I actually had a personal question leading to what you were just explaining. So you talk about like establishing a universal language through a means of drawings that you produce. And I saw in your project that you use photography as a means to, you know, kind of like, I think that's a universal language that can be used. I noticed that there's a specific graphic style that you prefer, which is usually like black and white and with very minimalistic colors. Is that something you feel which is universal and can be used like everywhere? Is that you feel like you have worked in different contexts? That is the sort of graphic style that you would like see that can be used as a universal language, I would say.
That's a very good question. And actually it's quite, I really have to give you a very personal reply to that. Okay. Because I'm very keen on representation. So representation for me is something that is very important. And in that sense, let's say this sort of more technical architectural representation was the way that I found the easiest way to go about very complex projects. Mm-hmm. So if for every project we would have to enter a completely different graphic style, I found that would be, you know, just a kind of cacophony of things. So this rigidity of representation was a kind of instrument for me personally to be able to navigate and compare. Comparison, not every project is different, but the comparison from the method point of view. So how methodologically we could compare projects, and how does, in that sense, very much iterative and incremental process of learning and knowledge development that a previous project, so for instance, the Kiruna project was a seeding project for me personally to inform this kind of way of relating land, water, and climate conditions. Yeah. And that scripting taxonomic way of thinking, how do you translate that in technical sections, in the urban design scale of the plan? So that effort then I have been using in other projects, although the thinking process is differently, but I can somehow see a continuum. Yeah. So and also with students, actually, it has been quite useful again to compare very different case studies. So methodologically in the studio, we use a certain rigidity in representation techniques, just as a kind of default, no? So the protocols of the studio, but also embracing new media. So we hope to break that rigidity, but not yet. We're not yet successful to break that rigidity.
Yeah, but it's really interesting, like the way you use graphics to understand how the projects can be different, but there's some similarity and there's some comparison that can be drawn out of it. So any final questions, anyone? If anyone is interested, then I think we are going to wrap up.
Hi, Taneha.
Hi.
I just had a quick question and also like a comment on what you talked about water sensitivity in Kozhikode. I come from a hometown that's very close to that place, so it's very nice to to be able to know that that knowledge is like kind of universal right now, and that you were like very open to it. So I think my question was, since you mentioned that you design with nature and nature-based like solutions, how much of an agency do you give to technology, and how much of an agency do you give to technology that's like from other countries, like that's from foreign? And how do you think that merges with the local technology?
So a very difficult and important question. Hybrids. So this has been, you have to go about hybrids, meaning that you cannot think that, you know, the project will go about a full nature-based design or the retrofitting of green-blue infrastructure in existing traditional infrastructure, monofunctional infrastructure. I think you, especially in places in which you have still deficit in infrastructure, meaning that the demographic pressure is too high for the infrastructure to cope with that. We still have to go about a combination of gray infrastructure with green-blue infrastructure. So and that it's very much, it's local based. So up to what extent we can use the existing gray infrastructure and augment the performance of this existing gray infrastructure with spatial design. So with green, blue, yellow in terms in an arid context design. So again, it's very much local based, but I would say that, you know, if you think about it's a hybrid between existing and novel design, novel elements that could be retrofitted, but also in that sense, and that has been our research on what exists from both Kozhikode, it's really amazing, but also Bush has been and Bhopal on this such an intelligent way of designing on a catchment scale. So how do you move between upper, middle, and lower part of the catchment with specific well systems and the step wells and the infiltration of water in the ground. So in Kozhikode, so all the different conditions of wetlands. So how much of that can be not only seen now as, for instance, in terms of Kozhikode, as an eco park, but actually can really be seen as a performative space, and something that can be, again, to a certain extent, be placed in a systemic thinking with other existing practices. And then what is the necessity to retrofit more, so to bring more green and blue design, or even more gray design along the way. Because at the end, you have to provide for water supply, you have to provide for water safety, and you have as much as possible to rehabilitate the environment. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to take it from here to make sure that we give you a digital applause for an incredible lecture that has gotten us thinking on many of the issues that we are actually discussing in our classes, studios, methods, theories, histories. I feel like you have you have done a tour de force to remind us all the very important things that we have at hand. And then, you know, a very careful approach to addressing them with, I think, an incredibly critical mindset. So I think I represent all the students in thanking you, but I think this is an opportunity for sending you that applause.
Thank you so much. It was my great honor to be with you today and to share a bit of our constant struggle.
We hope this is the beginning of a conversation. As you see, we are two Master of Urban Design degrees in different schools, trying to establish a conversation, because it's not about institutional competition. And I think learning from the way in which you are addressing issues in Europe, but also working globally, is incredibly inspiring for us. As you can tell, you have activated a lot of questions and many of our students coming from India. And I think this is also one of the most important issues for us. Urban design is truly a global practice. So much of what we can do is creating, communities of knowledge and communities of practice that are very much based on this notion of mutual learning. So it was a real pleasure, and as I say, we hope this is just the beginning.
Yes, it's just the beginning of a dialogue and exchange. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Marta. Mona had to leave, and so we'll be in touch after this. We keep the conversation. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.